thanks very much to Ethical Consumer for the invitation to be here, and particularly I say that as someone who comes from the animal protection perspective, because very often we get dropped off the CSR or broader agenda. So I think it's really important when we're talking about these issues that we can join them up and we include animal protection as one of those issues that we really want corporates to take action from. So from my point of view, I lead Cruelty Free International. For those of you who've been active around the animal testing issue for some time, that's the organisation that used to be BUAV, which was a fairly awful name for all kinds of reasons. So now we have a progressive, hopefully forward-looking name that the media can actually pronounce and understand, which is proving a bonus now. What we do is we lead the campaign on animal testing, and we do that in a variety of ways. So we lobby, we get governmental change, we work with regulators, we have teams of scientists and lawyers to try and get alternatives used, and critically, for the purposes of this discussion, we also work with corporations and governments to get them to change behaviour, and particularly we work with industry to get them to move away from animal testing. And we do that in a variety of ways, but one of the critical things that we do is we certify good practice. So if you've ever picked up a bottle and you've seen that little leaping bunny symbol on a bottle, we own that symbol internationally, we roll that out worldwide, and a company has to prove what they say. There's always been talk on the high street around animal testing. Every company in the world claims that they're not tested on animals. They have their own symbol. They'll say people tested, not tested. They have their own version of a bunny. Companies kind of worked out 15, 20 years ago that this was a good thing that consumers wanted, and then they all found their own way of demonstrating it, which was largely meaningless. So we brought together a coalition of organisations worldwide, and we set up a proper certification programme. And in order to get the bunny, you have to prove what you say. So we audit companies' supply chains, we make them adopt a cut-off date. We can spend a couple of years behind the scene with a company to actually drive right through their supply chain, look right at all of their ingredients, go down to the level beyond the initial manufacturer, right down through the supply chain to make them prove what they say. And when they can do that, we actually award them the Leaping Bunny logo. And we do that in combination with trying to get change through the law, because there are some companies, we're rolling along the high street, so a lot of the good guys have done the right thing, but there will always be companies who need to be brought to the table because legislation is around the corner. And we led the successful campaign to end cosmetics testing in the European Union, and that has seen a step change in the number of corporations that now want to talk to us. So you do need sometimes all of those levers to be pushed all at once, and that's what my organisation does.
Perfect.
Skip me, because I've already...
Yeah, I mean, yeah, sure.
Yeah. I think I've already had plenty of time to introduce myself. So.
My name is Jonathan Bartley. I'm one of the co-leaders of the Green Party. Needless to say, Greens were absolutely devastated by the decision in the referendum to leave. And I think we're facing now a watershed moment, and how we respond to that in the next 2 years are going to be absolutely critical. And I'm thrilled to see, the title of this conference, Collaborating for Change, because we've got to collaborate, we've got to come together in a way I think that we've never done before. We were worried about environment and health, we were worried about jobs, controlling big business, freedom of movement, and peace and security. Now, there is clearly no plan as things stand, or not that we're being told about, for what triggering Article 50 would look like. And this is a moment to try and shape that. But I also want to talk a little bit about why political change is important in this context. I think what we heard in the no vote, in the leave vote, we have to listen to and we have to address. It was a cry from many parts of the country for taking back control. And I think that's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to give people that control at the local level, to create those strong local economies, to give people that participation, and to take on the big corporations, because that control has been taken away, not just by politicians, but by big corporations. And I think people are getting that now. So this is an opportunity to do that. But it's also an opportunity, I think, to speak very loudly about the electoral system. Because when people voted in that referendum, they knew for the first time, perhaps in a generation, in their lifetimes, that their vote would really count. Many places in the country have suffered generations of neglect by both Labour and Conservative governments because they were safe seats. You could pin a red rosette on a donkey and it would be elected in some places in the UK. And so those places were neglected by both Conservative and Labour over generations, the industrial decline in the north particularly being a case in point. Now, if we change the electoral system, we change that forever. And suddenly it isn't just the few 100,000 voters in swing seats that get targeted with the messages about efficiency savings or inheritance tax savings, but actually the concerns of everyone in this room will suddenly be put on the agenda. And have I got time just to share a quick story? Very quickly, this hit home to me in about 2010. My son's a wheelchair user, and we were about to go to an appointment at the Evelina Children's Hospital, and we spotted some TV vans over by the side of the road. And it turned out David Cameron, in 2010, in the middle of the general election, was giving a speech. So we went over to have a little look. The Tory party worker milling about outside spots the kid in the wheelchair, comes over to me and says, "Would you mind having a picture taken with David Cameron?" I said, "No, that would be great." So they set it all up, they brought out David Cameron, and we went over to him, and I said, "Mr. Cameron, do you mind if I ask you some questions?" And I started to ask him about Tory plans for disabled children. Suddenly, 20 TV cameras appeared from nowhere and started live streaming this on BBC, on Sky. It came up in the leadership debates in the evening, and for 24 hours, in the middle of a general election campaign, we had a debate about disabled children. That will never happen again in any general election campaign until we change the electoral system, because it will only be those few 100,000 voters in swing seats which the parties need to convince, and they won't need to convince them on the basis of disabled children, and they won't need to convince them on the issues that we are going to be discussing today. If we change the electoral system, suddenly every vote counts, every voice counts, and every issue really counts. And that's why I think we've got to work together on the left as progressive parties to collaborate, to get rid of this dangerous Conservative government and introduce electoral reform which will change people's lives forever.
A round of applause before we even started the debate. That's good. That's good. Constance.
Wow. I'm following up on this. So my name is Constance, and 3 years ago... Yeah, which one? Two.
You can choose.
Okay. So 3 years ago, I co-founded a small organization that is a workers' cooperative based in London called Altgen. And we support young people to set up workers' cooperatives as a solution to youth unemployment and unpaid internship, precarious employment, precarious freelance work, as also a way of reclaiming our economy and creating a much fairer and more democratic economy. So I graduated, so I'm originally French, which I'm going to mention just in case you wouldn't have noticed. So I'm originally French, and I came to England, to the UK, 6 or almost 7 years ago now. Did a year master's. I was very interested in the art and craft movement at the time, and I thought I would study it here in the UK. And life took me and kept me here. I adopted the UK as my home. And I started working as a freelancer after 2009, when it was the economic crisis that we are still living in today, and the end of a system that has shown is not working for anyone. And I thought I had done all the great things that I had to do. I had done some internships and worked, and I was a freelancer, and I realized that I was actually being quite badly treated by my clients. I had no tools to actually trade as a sole trader by myself, competing against my other friends, actually, graphic designers or designers, and I realized that it was not only my situation, my story, but the story of hundreds and hundreds of us, the next generation at the workplace. What workplace was this? And I also worked in different agencies and design departments, and I couldn't find a place where the workers, and especially the young person, was taken into consideration. I had no voice, I had no say over the organization. There was a terrible feeling of competition and power struggles, and that was not the workplace that I had imagined I would be coming into. And I met someone, and I discovered the word cooperative just caught my curiosity. And I met someone, and she said, "Our generation is fucked." And I said to her, "I want to do something about it now." And she said, "Okay, let's do it." And we started Altgen like this, from this mad ambition that we would solve a generational problem. And it's going well. We have 10 seconds. So we set up Altgen, and we also set up a young European cooperators network. So through this mad work, we ended up doing lots of policy work in the cooperative movement. We discovered the cooperative movement with our ideals as young people, and we wanted to reinvent what the cooperative movement would be. But we realized that there was a bit of a gap between what we were claiming to be the new, fair, more democratic economy and some of the bad aspects of the cooperative movement. So we ended up being on stage and invited to lots of conferences talking about young people claiming for a fairer economy. And through this work, we met lots of European young people that were claiming for the same thing. So we set up a young European cooperators network. And today, more than ever, with this post-Brexit, we are in the need to work together, not only on a European level, but in an international level. We are fighting against a neoliberal narrative, a neoliberal plan, and it's international. And it's through this international collaboration that we will win. So, yeah.
Yeah, so as you've heard, my name's Matt Grady and I work for Traidcraft. You may have heard my colleague speak earlier suggesting that Traidcraft is a private company selling ethical goods. And we also have a charity wing which does policy, trying to advocate for the government to change its policies. It's clear then that there's lots of challenges for the government after the EU referendum. They're going to have to balance political, economic and legal issues that are pretty much all of them in their own take us into uncharted territory, but putting them all together is going to be a real challenge. The negotiations to leave the EU are complex. The government needs to contend with satisfying those of the people in the country that have decided they wanted to leave, while reassuring the other half of the country that wanted to stay. Once they get to a point where the government has decided what they mean by Brexit, then they're going to have to go forward to negotiate with the EU. And that brings its own set of political challenges, because you've got the Commission, you've got the Council, you've got the Parliament, all of them jockeying for sort of seniority and power. And then you've got the balance, the needs of all of the individual member states. I've heard our government say that they think it's going to be quite straightforward, that it's not going to be in the EU's interests to be tough on the UK. I think you could look at that from the other perspective and suggest that the EU is at a kind of critical point. As one member leaves, it's not going to be as straightforward as just giving them the same access as they had before. In my mind, it's not going to be in their interest to make it easy for the UK to leave. Otherwise, where does it go after that with other members? So I guess I say all of that just to highlight the fact that it's not going to be easy. It's going to be a complex task, and there's going to be lots of challenges for the government to consider. So on top of the political side, you've got the legal challenges, the intricacies of withdrawing from the EU, taking the UK out of the treaties. Some of them, some EU trade deals we are listed as an individual signatory, and others we're listed as part of a membership of the EU. So they've got the challenge there. They've got the challenge of organising WTO membership and restoring that. And then the potential legal challenges, even just in assessing whether the government has the authority to invoke Article 50 without Parliament. We've seen some progress on that today. And then there's the economic challenges. So, future prospects for UK PLC remain in the balance. The costs for businesses trading with the EU and further afield is a question mark. If those increase, then it's going to hit the UK competitiveness. We're likely to see a rise in unemployment. We're likely to see higher costs of living. It's a period of really uncertainty. So coming into how Traidcraft fits into all of that, our main concern is the impact on developing countries of Brexit. And they're faced with the prospect of trade disruption and increasing the cost of trading with the UK. In addition to the prospect of paying increased taxes, sterling is lowered in value relative to other currencies, which means that developing economies can expect a reduction in demand for their goods. We can expect that in reduced profit margins in supply chains, and the lower value of aid aid money won't go as far. So we want the government to ensure continued market access for developing countries. The government needs to also consider the impacts on developing economies if it moves forward with trade agreements with other developed and OECD countries. So, for example, if the UK is going to negotiate a trade agreement with a large agriculture exporting country like Australia, it needs to look at what the impacts are going to be on developing countries already exporting to the UK. And it needs to find ways to limit the damage. The government also needs to conduct a full review of trade and investment policy to ensure that the UK policy aligns with its international commitments on human rights, sustainable development and climate change. So to sum up, lots of complex challenges, and the government has to act to ensure that it's not developing countries that pay the cost of Brexit.
Thanks very much.
I'm actually going to bring animal issues and environmental issues together on this, actually, because we were very concerned about the vote. I mean, there may be questions coming up on animals later, so I'll give you, from an animal welfare point of view, what our concerns are, and they're numerous. But around environmental protection, there have been quite a lot of environmental laws, as you'll know, that have been through the European Union, some of which have a direct impact on my area around animal testing. So REACH, for example, the most famous, the most wide-ranging bit of European legislation around our issue. One of the problems with that is that that has been legislation that, whilst it's been welcomed by a lot of environmental organisations, it's certainly had a cost in terms of animal life, with all of these chemicals that are already existing on the market having to be tested again. We've been through the pain of some of that. We've worked really hard to mitigate some of the effects of that legislation in terms of animal protection, and we've gained in Europe quite a lot of steps forward with that legislation. So commitment to data sharing, for example, between companies. We've done a lot of the testing. We're now making sure that we don't have to retest some of those chemicals. I'm concerned that some of the things that we have gained, where we've worked together with environmental organisations on the same page, are at risk if we now have to disaggregate some of that. I mean, I would have thought that some of the environmental protections that we have and some of the legislation that impacts on us, like the REACH directive, are so huge, so complicated, and in a way so already part of doing business for some of UK corporations that it would be almost unthinkable for the government to strip themselves out of it. And I would have thought there'll be an outcry from business who will not want to go through any different regime, having already been through the regime where they've had to submit all of their chemicals for testing. Because if we have to see national regimes to take the place of what's now a well-established European regime, we could see calls for different kinds of testing. And the push from our point of view is to harmonise that, so you don't see animals being needed for tests that are being repeated elsewhere in the world.
Thanks very much. Marilyn, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'll be answering from the perspective of, issues that relate to corporate accountability. I mean, in general, we find that business likes certainty, and it likes to know that what it has to do in one place, it maybe also has to do in another. So I think while there maybe is a temptation for government to kind of start all over again, there will be a pushback from companies that operate in lots of different jurisdictions to keep the requirements the same where possible. Having said that, there's recently been progress at European level on requirements for companies to report on environmental impacts. We already have that in UK law, and we were hoping that the transposition of that directive would be an opportunity to extend what's there already. We know that the transposition will go ahead, but rather than extending UK law, it might actually be used to limit it. So I think the way those things play out is still to be seen. As well, from our perspective, there's also the issue of what companies do overseas. And in that respect, you know, our legislation, there's nothing there at all. You know, a company can carry on as it likes in Zambia, Tanzania, Bangladesh, you know, there's nothing in place there. And again, I think we were starting to see some progress at the European level on saying you need to be more aware of what's going on in your subsidiaries, you need to be more aware of what's going on in the supply chain. And I think there will be a resistance to make more progress on that from the UK government. So it's a challenge, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So the question is, you know, are we more or less concerned? Clearly more concerned. I think we've got to lock down the environmental protections as much as we can. We've got to come together to do that. During the EU referendum campaign, we talked up the positives of the EU membership. We were blunt about the risks of leaving the EU. And these concerns are just as valid now as they were before the 23rd of June. Environmental pollution, threats to wildlife, climate change doesn't respect national boundaries. As consumers and citizens, workers and students, many of us make use of the huge opportunities that freedom of movement brings across the EU, and we want to hold on to that. We still want access to the market. But I think above all, in the age of globalized trade where multinationals, as we just heard, are more wealthy than entire nations, corporations certainly work across national boundaries too, and with the greatest of ease. So we need that freedom of movement to match it. It shouldn't just be capital that's moving across those borders. We're deeply worried about what happens next. We need to harness the collective concern in this room and more widely, both as consumers but also as citizens, and to protect what we've got and we hold dear. Sometimes that's going to be in relation to specific policies and directives. What will the UK's relationship be with the emerging circular economy package, for example, in the EU, that's currently in progress? What about a relationship to the new organic regulations that are taking shape? Where exports to the EU are concerned, we still need to meet the EU-wide standards if we're going to export, but that clearly only covers part of the story. And in some ways, it's the threat to the overarching principles that is the great concern. For example, DEFRA Minister George Eustice recently criticised the EU's precautionary principle. I think that should really ring alarm bells for us, and that's another cause for concern. And I think we need to look at the reality across the Atlantic, which isn't, you know, comforting either. The precautionary principle has underpinned bans on GM foods, bee killing, pesticides. Ditching it is clearly bad news for health, consumers, and it's bad news for the environment. If and when we leave, we should still choose to keep those EU environmental standards and protections as a baseline, and I think that is the baseline from which we should work. Thanks.
Yeah, obviously deeply concerned. Well, a quick little story about the YEC and the Young European Cooperators Network that we have embarked ourselves in. It's a very interesting work because it means gathering in a room with young people from, I think at the moment there are 13 different countries, and young cooperators from those different countries, which means different cultures. So I felt that I was living a mini European Union moment at the last gathering, where there are massive clashes of cultures, and we're all talking about cooperation, but in a slightly different way, with different mannerisms and different practices of collaboration, actually. So it has been a very enriching experience, and actually what I feel is that we got the best out of each cooperator's ideas or cooperator's practices. The varieties is just amazing, and I think this is what collaboration is. And obviously at first we were quite younger and naive, and we were thinking, oh, they're not like us. They're not that revolutionary. They're not talking about the environment as we are talking about the environment, but actually the cross-pollination of what happened in these gatherings has been quite fruitful in terms of exchange and as I said, cross-pollination. And on the environmental topic, we had a 2.5 hours long debate at the last gathering around the idea of setting up a co-op that was an aircraft cooperative. And the big debate was it acceptable for the new generation of cooperators to actually even set up an aircraft co-op? So obviously us were saying definitely not. And some of us in the room were saying, yes, why not? And actually in this debate and in this exchange of ideas, that's where progress happened. And I think that's it for me again. And so I definitely think that being together is a much better idea.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the question is, what can we expect from this government? We've already seen them supporting fracking. We've seen them arguing over emissions with the EU. I'm not optimistic that they're going to be any more supportive or creating any better an environment. We saw ministers talking about taking an axe to red tape and trade barriers. And there's no doubt that there are some barriers to trade that can be removed without removing environmental protections. But what the government calls trade barriers, some other people would often call human rights standards, labour rights, environmental protection standards.
Most companies didn't want to come out. I mean, we all remember the debate in the run-up. We were told it was going to be an economic disaster, and businesses were very much there making the case. And maybe that's actually one of the reasons why people voted to leave, is that they feel that politicians and businesses are hand in hand acting in their own interests, and that those interests are not the same as the interests of ordinary people. And we can have a debate about that. I mean, personally, I can't see how the economic consequences are going to be positive. It's going to be very challenging economically, I think. But businesses were arguing, I think, for themselves, not so much with their workers in mind. I think, as I said when I was speaking, perhaps the challenge for us now is to come together, and including with businesses in this, and to say, what does responsible business look like post-Brexit? To try and build a really wide coalition, saying it can't be about a race to the bottom. We want to see the maintenance of standards. We want to see a system that works for people and the environment. A couple of other points. And one was that it's interesting to see that the Business Advisory Group to the Prime Minister, which is a group that has argued for deregulation in the past, has now been disbanded. Perhaps not surprisingly, because I think almost every company in it had argued to stay in the European Union. So, now that we're on the way out, perhaps the Prime Minister doesn't want advice from those people. So we may start to see a bit more room for SMEs to have some influence, which, they don't have a huge influence at the minute, and maybe some more thought given to the consequences for self-employed people. So perhaps when we think about what is the business role in influencing the exit negotiations, we need to think about it completely in the round. You know, yes, big businesses will be at the table. Of course they are. They're always there. But business now is much more than those giant multinationals. And how do they have a voice together, of course, with civil society?
We go with Jonathan next, and then.
It's easy to tar all businesses with the same brush. There are some things in common. I think the big thing, I think it's already been mentioned, that businesses really hate is uncertainty. And they're not going to they don't like the situation that we're in at the moment, where there is no clear direction. They don't know how to plan. They don't know where to invest, and you see a lot on hold. And we've heard the Brexiteers cheering loudly that there hasn't been economic collapse. Look, it's all gone through, it's all fine. But, you know, we haven't even started thinking about what the future's going to hold. And, you know, I think when businesses start to see the announcements made and the indication of which way we're heading, whether we're heading for a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit, whether we're going to have that freedom of movement or access to the single market or not, then we're really going to start to see businesses speak up. But I think I really want to echo what's just been said about a vision. We need to show what our vision of good trade is and what our vision of good business is in this context. And we've got to point people towards it. And I think the left in this country hasn't been very good at that. We've been very good at opposing stuff, but we haven't been actually very good at showing what's good. And so we have to decide what we want to campaign for, and then we have to go for it. One of my heroes is Tony Benn. And when he retired, he said, "I'm leaving the House of Commons to concentrate on politics." And it was his conviction that actually you can shift whole agendas at times like this. You can shift the goalposts, you can shift the terms of debate if you give people a positive vision, if you give people an idea of what could be possible. And that's what people are really lacking. They're lacking a plan, they're lacking a vision. When I worked in the House of Commons in the early 1990s, I remember getting a letter across my desk about 1995 from a guy called George Dent up in Scotland, a university lecturer. He said, "I've got this great idea. Got this idea for a year of debt remission in the year 2000, a year of Jubilee. What do you think of that?" And I nearly fell off my chair laughing, thinking, this is never going to happen. No one's talking about this. But here was a guy who had an idea, and he had a vision, and he had a plan. And churches got together with unions, got together with campaign groups, Jubilee 2000. I remember being in the House of Commons as we got letters through the post with pound coins on them saying, "Use this to pay off the debt." It was fantastic. And they managed to shift the whole agenda. And 5 years later, the G8 was sitting around saying, not which country's debt shall we cancel, but how do we do this right now? And that shows what can happen. For something that wasn't on the agenda to something is, but you have to have a vision, people have to come together, and we have to work together. And we need to do that if we're going to take on the big business, the big corporations who are going to be shouting very, very loud. We need to have that similar power. So I think, the question is, how do you think companies will influence exit negotiations? I maybe want to turn it around and say, how are we going to influence exit negotiations? How are we going to work with those businesses that we can do, and how are we going to take on the corporations that want perhaps a race to the bottom in terms of deregulation?
Thanks.
So what we can see from our front is lots of young people and young freelancers that have been suddenly very politically engaged recently, especially with the Brexit. And obviously feeling let down and disillusioned about they wanted to remain, obviously, because they are a generation of people who work and collaborate across borders, and it's part of their identities to be born as Europeans, and they feel deeply angry, lots of them, and motivated to change things politically. So I've got a bit of a hope in terms of actually this momentum of young people, especially freelancers, understanding that alone we don't go that far, but together we can create more sustainable and we can act on systemic change. So we are looking at developing a freelancers cooperative at the moment, and this is a way of engaging people at the workplace, re-injecting the idea of solidarity. So what does it mean to not be an atomized workforce that is being exploited and isolated, but what does it mean to work together and to organize ourselves to have some leverage, some weight, and to support one another, to trade better. So yeah, I would say I'm taking an optimistic spin on this.
I think it depends really on individual sectors making assessments about what's in their own interest, I think, is how they will try and influence the negotiations. Some sectors will decide that they need to trade with the EU, and they'll be pushing really strongly for continued market access. Others will think that they want to open up new markets in other places. There was some research done recently that showed that 60% of the meetings taken by permanent representatives to the EU involved corporate lobbyists, and 20% had civil society organisations involved. So I guess I would just echo the comments made by some of the other panel members. We need to find ways to rebalance that and to push back against that.
Okay, Michelle.
I mean, the question is, how do we think companies will influence the exit negotiations? And they're influencing them now. I mean, they're already having influence within, they've already had influence within the European Union. They're getting organised. They're getting ready to put their agenda forward, as they should. And likewise, we should get organised and ready across our sector to be able to describe the kind of vision that we have for what we want in the UK. I think it's quite interesting. A lot of the companies that we work with are multinationals, and I echo your point that the thing they do not want is uncertainty, and they also don't want a patchwork of regulations. So from that point of view, we can be on the same side in saying, yes, we want to see a harmonising of regulations, but we want to harmonise them upwards. We want to make sure that we haven't lost the progress that we've gained. On our issue, for example, you know, we've got this cosmetics testing ban now right across the European Union, and our agenda is to take that internationally. We've got bills going through from the US to Russia. Now, actually, we've got industry on the same side in some of those discussions for the first time because they don't want the extra cost. I don't think they've all become evangelical converts to cruelty-free living, but they don't want the extra cost and this burden word again that there's going to be with complying with different kinds of regulations. So I think if we have an international vision, that will help us, because actually a lot of the industry that we're working with, they're also multinational. I also think, you know, as depressed as some of us were about the vote, and that's not my organisation's point of view, by the way, we need to see this as an opportunity, because we have very often in my sector the excuse that we would love to go further, Michelle, we would love to do more, but we can't because of the European Union. And government has used that as an excuse in terms of progress, and business has been quite happy sometimes to sit behind that excuse. So I think we now have to take that back to them and say, all these wonderful things, this great world that you wanted to create for animals, now's your opportunity to create that world, because you don't have all the blocks that you've told me you have for all of these years. So I think actually going back to people and saying, okay, you've now got freedom, this is the kind of vision that we expect, and also tuning in with those businesses that are looking at this from an international perspective so we can change the world, not just what happens on our own doorstep.
I guess the first thing I would say is I probably wouldn't advocate the government to negotiate new trade agreements with developing countries. The domestic markets are not ready for competition. It infringes on their policy space, so possibly I wouldn't go down that route. We'd much rather see the government introducing non-reciprocal duty-free market access for developing countries, which would allow them to continue to trade with the UK, which would allow their industries to continue to build and grow. Having said that, one thing the government could do, to keep it concise, is rethink its support for bilateral investment treaties. Marilyn mentioned in her talk earlier about investor-state dispute settlement, ISDS, which allows companies to sue governments if they introduce policies that hit their profits. The UK has 105 bilateral investment treaties which contain these mechanisms. So one of the easy things they could do is withdraw support for that, and that would protect the policy space of developing countries if they wanted to introduce legislation, for example, on labour rights or anything like that.
Okay, my question would be, what do you think that we have the right government? First question. Second question, I think this Brexit is a democratic crisis and political crisis. So I'm hoping that we are not talking about a government that is going to stay for long. So my answer would be, we will have a political awakening, and there is change happening right now. So, yeah.
I agree. I think this is a political question. No, Theresa May only got the job because everyone else ran away. Right, really. But the people that she's got around her, this is really worrying. You've got our new International Trade Secretary, Liam Fox, probably the most hardline pro-US free trader in the cabinet. He's called for a return to the Victorian buccaneering spirit, that buccaneering spirit which pillaged most of the world. You've got David Davis, the Brexit minister, saying he's in favour of a hard Brexit. This is why we're calling for everyone to have a say on the terms of Brexit, not to rerun the referendum. That decision is clear and we have to respect it. But we need a second referendum on the terms of what's going to happen. We were given no plan, we were given no vision. People are not having a say in this process. It's been left up to others to call the shots, and a government really which has no mandate to do it. And if they're not going to have a second referendum, then they need to call a general election. And we need to put it to the people, and everyone needs to have a say in this, and we need to have a debate about it, because these decisions are too important, are going to affect too many people's lives, particularly through these international trade deals, if we don't do this. And I think it is time for a political awakening, and I think we should say this loudly and clearly.
I think we need to reignite what used to be a very big movement calling for fair trade. We heard earlier about Jubilee Debt Campaign. Around the time of Make Poverty History, some people might remember, 2005, many years ago, there were 3 calls in that campaign: aid, trade and debt. I used to work for Oxfam, and they had a campaign called Make Trade Fair. It's the biggest campaign that Oxfam ever ran. And it was about this really complex issue of international trade rules and the way that they work. Can you imagine that there was a campaign on that? But there was, and it was massive. Look at the work and the campaigning that's gone on around TTIP. I mean, again, pretty complex stuff, but you've seen a massive mobilisation. And I think if we can revitalise that, for many people it's already there, they remember it, they were involved. Lots of people, it's new for them. But let's see what we can do. Go in and educate parliamentarians so they're equipped to hold the government to account, because at the minute they're not. If you went in and talked to them about this stuff, they wouldn't understand it. So there's a real job there to do. And I think lastly, if it does come down to the government attempting to renegotiate trade deals, it's about supporting and strengthening developing country negotiators. The Doha development round in the WTO collapsed because developing country governments walked out one by one. Now, in a bilateral, it's much more difficult, but that is something that we could do as a movement.
Yes. Would you like me to say that?
Go on, elaborate for us.
Yes, I do. I think we need to understand where we are. We have a series of laws and directives that come from the European Union, and quite a lot of those govern what we can and cannot do to animals in this country. Not all of our legislation around animal protection is European. We have a lot of domestic legislation too, and we assume that that will be preserved and protected. But we have a lot of EU-wide legislation around, we've got the European cosmetics ban. That makes a difference because multinational businesses are more likely to sit up and take notice if they have something that's affecting the largest trading bloc that they have around cosmetics. They weren't as likely to sit up and take notice when it was just a UK ban. We've got other laws governing the use of animals in research. The major directive that covers that area is just currently undergoing a review in the European Union. We were hoping to ratchet up some standards there around primates, around suffering, around cats and dogs, what's going to happen to that work. We've got obviously standards around farm animals. I thought it was really interesting during the debate when we were leading up to Brexit. I think it was Boris Johnson that said, if we win Brexit, we will the next day end live exports, because that was one of the things that, you know, with all this power that we could do. The very same government that's actually blocked 8-hour rules for transport in the European Union when some of these proposals have come from other countries like Germany. So I think we're very nervous that we may preserve some of what we have. I think things like the Cosmetics Directive now are too set in stone for those to be rowed back. And actually industry has got used to that. Industry's used to working with it. And just last week, we won a landmark case at the European Court of Justice where we fought back the industry that was trying to unravel the cosmetics ban. So that's been all the way through to the highest court in Europe and back, and we've won that argument. We have a steady cosmetics ban. That's good. I think we'll preserve what we have. My question will be, how will we go further? Will we go further? You've got to realise that apart from actually the Green Party and a couple of last-minute efforts from the Labour Party at the last election, none of the parties really had animal protection in their manifestos or made it a political commitment. And we didn't see any difference in government when we had the coalition government. They had one pledge on animal protection that we helped them craft, and that was broken by the end of that parliament. So I think we actually have to look very hard. We've won a lot of gains at a European level. We have a European centre that validates alternative methods. We have progressive legislation. We have things moving forward, and that's giving a signal to industry that these things really matter. So I think it's down to all of us now. In a sense, we've still got the same job to do. You know, we've been doing a job to try and influence the UK as part of the European Union. We've now got a job to do to try and influence the UK, not only to protect what we currently have for animals, but to make sure that they live up to their promises, and this new dawn makes them go further.
So despite being a vegetarian for more than 20 years, turned out when I came to do this that I knew nothing about animal welfare protection. So of course I Googled it. And it gives you a good idea of how much EU law is now in UK law. So protection of farm animals, or legislation around farm animals, 17 laws from Europe. On wildlife, 11 from Europe. And on animals in research, 9 from Europe. So, you know, potentially lots of things to roll back, or lots of things to fight for. I mean, opportunities might be, I guess, to redirect some of the subsidies that are paid under the CAP towards animal protection. There's a space that maybe there, and maybe introducing new standards. One that I was reading about earlier was, you know, for instance, CCTV in slaughterhouses. Let's though think radically, and could we call for all food procured by government to be vegetarian? Now that would be really groundbreaking. I don't think it would go down too well with the meat industry though, but we could try for it if we wanted.
Jonathan, do you want to go next?
I've not got a lot to add to what's already been said. Yeah, Green Party have always championed animals. We had an animals had their own manifesto at the last election. The government's view is fundamentally to deregulate. You know, this is what's at the heart of it, and so I am really worried in answer to the question about what this means. But I do think the Common Agricultural Policy does present an opportunity. Since the referendum, statements from the government have raised huge concerns about farm animal welfare policy in terms of its vision and what would replace CAP. Suggestion that the UK might adopt New Zealand-style agrarian free market model is incredibly worrying in particular. it would leave farmers very vulnerable to market forces, and there's one study suggesting that only the largest 10% of farms would survive under that kind of model. So I think it's an opportunity to get farmers on side, and also look at how we transition farming in the UK. Again, putting forward a positive vision about how we transition farming. You know, when you go and visit these farms, I speak as a vegetarian myself, you know, I've done the 3D tours of the slaughterhouses, and you realise that farms aren't this green and pleasant land. They are these industrial places that often treat animals very, very badly, and are not particularly environmentally friendly in many respects. But there is an opportunity really to transition again away from the big farmers down to the small farmers, create that local farming opportunity. Again, when you get these moments of change, that is the chance to shape that change, and animal welfare could be central to that. So let's go for that.
I don't really have much more to add either. I'm about as optimistic on the environmental stuff as I am on the animal welfare stuff. I haven't heard anything from this government that suggests animal welfare is high on their agenda. So I do think there's lots to fight for here.
Okay.
I think what's come over in the panel is that you can't separate the two. You know, how we organise and run our economy is ultimately an ethical question. It's the same thing. I agree that we face, it's a profound crisis of democratic legitimacy. It's a crisis of our economic system. And it's a race now between unsustainable consumption, short-termism, ever-increasing inequality, and beginning to move to a different system. Our government at the moment does not offer lots of room for us to be optimistic about that. But we have to fight for something different, because if we don't do it, who else is going to do it? You know, often in my job, the most that we can hope for is that things don't get any worse. But if we were not there, they would be getting worse. And again, I would say that's why we've got to come together and set out a vision for what the future looks like. Lots of people, I think, especially older people, they voted for Brexit because they kind of wanted to turn the clock back. We can't turn the clock back, but we can set out a future that looks different from the present, and we must come together and do that.
Jonathan, would you like to get it?
I think it's about choices. Kind of Jeremy Corbyn's kind of in the room, isn't he? So I need to talk about him. He's here. I really like the way Labour are going. They've taken on a lot of Green Party policies, kind of off the shelf. And you know, why wouldn't we want to influence Labour? That's great. But I worry that deep down within Labour, still environmental issues are an add-on, whereas we should be looking at the economy, our society, our politics through the lens of environmentalism, because this is the big thing that's hanging over our head. We need to present that freedom from climate change. We need to free ourselves from climate change, and this is an opportunity. And I think while he's got some good ideas, he's not talking about transitioning the economy. He's talking about doing a lot of things, like he's supporting Hinkley, you know, £30 billion worth of subsidy for nuclear power, another £18 billion to centralise our energy, when I think we need to be investing in a renewables energy revolution, and we can't have both. We have to make these choices now, and we have to transition the economy. And if we invest, you know, just around, you know, we're an island, just offshore, we have enough renewable potential to get over six times our annual energy demand as it stands, according to the New Economics Foundation. It's there, offshore wind, wave. Renewable technology is advancing, and in post-referendum Britain, we need industry that we can export around the world. We need to be a world leader. We need to be exporting that technology. We know it would be jobs rich. We know that it would decentralize and give local communities back control if we have a renewable energy revolution in communities. And I think we need to be putting forward this vision and this alternative. Reheated 70s socialism actually isn't going to deliver. We need a new vision. We can work with Jeremy Corbyn, and I love a lot of what he's saying, but I don't think he really gets it, and we have to have this transition of the economy if we're going to free ourselves from climate change, if we are going to face the challenges of the 21st century. So in answering the question, how do we influence thinking back to ethical issues? Well, we need to see everything through the lens of ethical issues and everything through the lens of living within our means, getting growth in the right places, not the wrong places. We can't go on building roads, as Labour wants to do. We can't go on expanding airports, as Labour wants to do. We have to be realistic about what the future holds, and we have to say it loudly, and we have to face up to these issues, and we need to have a public conversation about it. That's one of the things I want to do as co-leader of the Labour Party. I want to work with Labour where we can, but we are different. And I think those of us, in this room need to make the decision about, what kind of world, what kind of vision for the future of the economy that we want, and then we need to run with it.
So the big narrative of Brexit was to take back control, and I think that actually cooperatives are about taking back control. Whether you're a consumer or a worker. So I would say, people will think ethically when they're put in front of cooperatives, because cooperatives are for the community, the people, and the environment, and they're about taking back control. So in terms of thinking more ethically, I would say I'm quite glad that we're talking about cooperatives again, and Labour is talking about cooperatives again, and new cooperatives in relation to the future of work, the new generation, and in a global context, in a global economy as well. We're on an island, but we're also living in a global context. So, yeah, thank you.